Hi, everyone. We have an in-person experiential summer intensive, June 22nd to 26th. If you're interested in that, just visit our website, jungchicago.org.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung in the World. In 1992, Judith Herman made visible what psychology had systematically ignored. While PTSD had been recognized back in 1980, largely through Vietnam veterans, the field still conceptualized trauma as something that happened once, acutely, and then was over. Herman understood it differently. For millions of people, particularly women and children, trauma wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a chronic condition of captivity. Under sustained domination, domestic violence, abuse, trafficking, captivity, identity itself is alienated. Her legacy endures in defining the complex PTSD symptoms and model. It endures in every clinician who now knows to ask about abuse histories as routine practice, in every survivor group where shame transforms into solidarity, and in the fundamental recognition that some wounds require more than therapy. They require careful reconstruction of everything that trauma destroys: safety, identity, and the capacity to trust another human being. It is my honor to speak with Dr. Herman about her work and what decades of listening to survivors has taught her. I invite you to join us. Hello, and welcome to Jung in the World. I'm Patricia Martin, and I'll be your host. Today, we're talking about trauma with the renowned psychiatrist and author, Judith Herman. Dr. Judith Lewis Herman is a senior lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. For 30 years, she was director of training at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's the author of the award-winning books Father and Daughter Incest and Trauma and Recovery. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and her latest book, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, was published in 2023. Dr. Judith Herman, welcome to Jung in the World. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I have so many questions. It was tricky to kind of pare them down. And I want to start with just where trauma has gone in the last decade in looking at the amount of content on the internet in our hybrid culture. It is so broadly applied that I wondered if you could start us off by just giving us your definition of the word trauma.
Well, there's always been some debate about what counts as trauma. One of the things we did, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized in the American Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual until 1980. That was really based on the testimony of the Vietnam veterans against the war who came back and said, we're home, but in our heads, we're still in Vietnam. And so, war trauma was kind of the paradigm at first. And then the question was, what else produced PTSD? And so in the 1990s, for the fourth edition of the diagnostic manual, DSM-4, I was on the post-traumatic stress committee of the American Psychiatric, and we took a look at what kind of events produced PTSD symptoms. And the question was, what about unpleasant and hurtful life events that weren't like combat? And what we found was that, for example, simple bereavement, being fired from a job, divorce, did those unfortunate life events produce PTSD? And the answer was no. What did produce PTSD was a kind of up close and personal encounter with violence. So either as a directly experiencing this or as a witness. So being sexually assaulted, being battered, being abused as a child, those encounters produce PTSD. Not in everyone, but in many people.
So proximity is important.
Proximity to death threat of death or bodily harm. The other people who get PTSD a lot are police, firefighters, people who see violence up close, even if they aren't personally harmed.
So that would include like first responders.
First responders, yeah. And in fact, one of the things we did at the Victims of Violence programs was we did trainings for police about post-traumatic stress disorder because they had a very kind of macho, suck it up kind of culture where you weren't supposed to show fear, you weren't supposed to show weakness, and you could medicate away your PTSD symptoms with alcohol. And that, that's unfortunately an increased risk for people who have this kind of exposure. Reporters in war zones, it's another example. And we would try to train them both to recognize post-traumatic stress disorder when they intervene in a, say, domestic violence call, but also to recognize that they're vulnerable to it and how to practice good self-care so that they don't develop it. So, when people say, oh, I had a bad hair day and it was so traumatic, no, that's not what we'd include. On the other hand, I'd rather have the definition be too broad rather than too narrow because you want to increase public awareness about how common this is.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I guess I would say that there will always be trauma with a capital T. Yeah. Facing a life or death situation, it's proximate to you, meaning it's very physically close. And you might feel like it's difficult to escape from it, like you're trapped in it somehow.
Like fight or flight doesn't work, and then the freeze response sets.
Yes. And then there are other things that you're describing that are traumatic. I mean, we have traumatic responses. And so I totally appreciate the way that you're sort of clarifying all of that. And it leads me to ask you a question about your 3-stage model for recovery.
Yeah.
Which everything I looked at, it seemed as if this 3-stage model of get to safety first, you have to remember the trauma, and then you have to reconnect. Do I have that right? And it seems that, well, let me just ask the question. Does this remain not the industry standard, the professional standard?
Well, it depends who you ask. I mean, there are a lot of proponents of what's called exposure treatment that goes directly to the trauma processing without, from my point of view, is adequate attention to safety in the present. So, I mean, it's hard for a person to say that was then, this is now, if they're still unsafe.
Right.
So there are some treatment models out there that don't recognize those recovery stages. On the other hand, you do now have things like just this year, Division 56, which is the trauma division of the American Psychological Association, came out with practice guidelines for adults with what I call complex trauma. That is trauma that results not from a single exposure like a fire or a flood or a car crash, but prolonged, repeated trauma where the victim is under the control of the perpetrator and re-exposed for days, weeks, like a hostage or an abused kid or political prisoner. And so certainly for complex trauma, the practice guidelines recognize 3 stages.
So this is interesting to me as well. I'm sure our audience will find it interesting too. You use the word captor in Trauma and Recovery, your book.
Yeah.
You talk about the perpetrator largely as a captor and the victim as the captive. And I'm just wondering if, since you wrote it in 1992, were those the words that were available to you, or was that a very specific choice?
Well, I wanted to emphasize the concept of coercive control because the methods of coercive control are the same the world over, and they're practiced. They're actually taught. They're similar. They were used in Chinese thought reform. They are taught by one secret police organization to another, including our CIA, which taught them to secret police throughout Latin America. They're used by pimps. They're used by domestic abusers and child abusers. I don't know what the training vector is for the domestic prisons, but I assume that it's pornography. The methods involve violence and threat of violence, but the violence doesn't need to happen often. It just needs to be very convincing when it happens. A saying in the battered women's movement, good beating is good for a year, because the women will say things like, I saw that look in his eyes and I realized, yes, he could kill me. And after that, he doesn't necessarily even have to raise his hand. He just needs to give her that look. And so there's violence and threat of violence, but then there are all these other techniques, control of bodily functions, like when the person eats, when the person sleeps, what the person is allowed to wear, when the person is allowed to go to the bathroom. Hostages describe this all the time. So a number of techniques to induce terror and submission, and then a number of other techniques to isolate the victim. So one of the first things I found in the first book I wrote, Father-Daughter Incest, was that incest families were described as socially isolated. The children weren't allowed to have friends over. They weren't allowed to go to friends' houses, things like that. The women weren't allowed to work or see family or friends. Well, it turned out isolation doesn't just happen, it's imposed.
Right. Hence the word captor, which means
Exactly.
you're sort of the jailer here.
Yeah. The abuser sometimes really is a jailer and sometimes is a dad, or a husband.
Interesting. So there's another version of this captivity that struck me as deeply insightful, but I want to go into it a little bit more. And that's this business of how coercive control can be preemptive, in that the captor, for whatever social connections exist, they will try to skew, or I guess the word would be triangulate, the narrative to make the woman, in this case, disbelievable, like incredulous. You're trying to create an impression that she's crazy so that anything she says won't be believed. Right. And that's a form of isolation. So this gets to the business of the amount of silence that needs to surround the abuse, the not talking about it. The closer they are to the actual abuser, there will be silence about it.
Well, right. I mean, tyranny, whether you're talking about a dictatorship in the political realm, whether you're talking about, domestic abuse and child abuse, depends on the silence of the bystanders. And so, yes, there are oftentimes people who knew or chose not to know. One of the people I interviewed for the new book is a woman named Kate Price, who's just come out with a book of her own called This Happened to Me. She grew up in Appalachia. Her father basically pimped her and her sister to truckers off truck stops when they were preteens, drugged them and took them to the truck stops and advertised them to truckers by CB radio under the code name Chicken Puckers. She managed to get out, to get an education. And one of the things she did, she's now at Wellesley, where she's running a study of, she's just started running a study of family-controlled child sexual exploitation. And she paired with a reporter at the Boston Globe, and they went back to her little town in Western Pennsylvania and interviewed people. And of course, it turned out that lots of people knew.
So what is your take on that as a psychiatrist? What would compel someone to stay silent? Is it just mere passivity, or is there something else going on?
Well, for the mom who knew she was battered, so she was charitable.
He wasn't going to sign up for another beating.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he probably said, I'll kill you if you ever, and if you ever try to get away. And I'll take the kids. And then for many other people, it was, well, none of my business.
Yeah. I just wonder sometimes, as more and more of these kind of stories like the one you shared rise into the press, rise into people's consciousness, if you sense that there's any shift happening in that, like the stories are starting to mount to a tipping point. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I think public consciousness is much higher than it was 20, 30 years ago, certainly. We had the first round of consciousness raising with second wave feminism, and that's when the rape crisis centers and the battered women's shelters were founded, not in the healthcare system, but by grassroots volunteer organizers. And we had the speak outs on rape and battering, and eventually things like child abuse and sex trafficking and harassment and so on. Just the array of gender violence that we now have data from the United Nations that basically says gender violence is the most common form of human rights violation in the world. So, yeah, we certainly have higher consciousness. And I think Kate's book is going to do for prostitution what some of the earlier books did for awareness on things like rape. Because I think it's still thought of as, victimless crime, a happy hooker. There's, there's a huge international industry that's penetrates every community. And, back in the day when we had phone books, remember phone books?
Yes, I do. I do happen to be of the vintage.
Of course, now the younger generation has never seen a phone book, but the yellow pages used to be where you advertised businesses. And so it said, go to your phone book, look up escort services. Now look at and see how thick the section is.
Mm-hmm.
And now look up pizza, and you'll see a section of about the same thickness.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about the moment when you were studying and studying the issue of battered women and their PTSD symptoms, and you were writing trauma and recovery. You said in I think it was the acknowledgments of trauma and recovery, that, the book could not have been possible without the feminist movement. And so here, that was in 1992. Now, all these decades later, and you have women who have, more women have college degrees, more women are in the society working in careers and at professional levels in unprecedented ways. So they're having economic success. And you talked about the need for there to be an imbalance, a fundamental power imbalance in these coercive, abusive situations. Has, in your opinion, with the success of women in all the arenas I just talked about, has that made us a more mutual society? Do you have hope that we're getting more to that mutuality that you envisioned?
Well, yes and no, because and one good way to analyze it, I think, comes from a little pamphlet that was written back in the, I think, 70s with the second wave, by a British author named Juliet Mitchell. And she wrote a little pamphlet called Women, the Longest Revolution. And she talked about how women's liberation was so much more complicated than, say, freeing the working class. So because the working class is oppressed in one domain, the domain of production. And that's the domain you talked about: jobs, education, public life. But she said, but women are oppressed in four domains: production, reproduction, sex, and family child rearing. And that you need progress in all four domains.
And that's a higher bar, isn't it?
And sometimes you can get progress in one domain, but a setback in another domain. And I think that's one of the things we've seen in the United States recently, where I would say in production, yes. I mean, back then, we used to wear buttons that said 59 cents. That was the amount that 59 cents on the dollar was what women made in pay for comparable work. And now I think for white women anyway, it's gone up to about 80 cents on the dollar, not for Black or Latino women. So yes, in production, there's been progress. On the other hand, in reproduction,
Yes.
in sex, it's not clear to me. I think, from what you hear about young women encountering sexual violence and that being, that and with the greater availability of porn, which is basically the erotization of dominance and subordination. A lot of young women encountering young men who want them to enact what they've seen in porn.
Yeah. You want me to do what?
To me, as though sex has gotten better for young women. And then childcare, I don't think we made the slightest progress in terms of the sharing of domestic duties.
Yeah, I think that by and large sounds accurate, although I will say, because I have I have two sons, and I also, because I just, I tune into this in my own community where I'll see a group of dads out for lunch, with their kids.
Kids. Yeah.
And having 20 years ago, I'm not sure I would have seen that. So I am seeing a cultural shift in an expectation that part of one's masculinity is, if you're a father, to be a better father, which means to be more engaged and to be more collaborative in child rearing. So there's room for optimism, I think, there. And I think you're right. We don't fully have a picture of it yet.
Well, that's true. And I certainly see that with my daughter and her husband. They have two little boys. So they collaborate nicely, I think.
Yeah.
And certainly the public availability of childcare is with no progress at all. So anyway, if you think about the status of women as multidimensional, then you see what a complicated thing it is to elevate the status.
Judy, I'm very curious. Well, first of all, I have to say, I was so struck. I was really moved by the profile that the New York Times did on you.
Yes.
It's quite a story, your professional journey. I just wonder if you would talk about that. Would you tell your own story?
Well, I think Ellen Baring kind of exaggerated, how disabled I was. I think, I think her original hook, I think, was going to be me versus Bessel van der Kolk. As how come he got to be king of trauma and I'm not queen of trauma?
Well, you were colleagues for a long time.
Oh, yeah, and we're friends. I mean, and anyway, then she heard that we kind of have each other's backs, and we collaborated, and
he credits you.
what?
He credits you.
Yeah, and I credit him. So I think it was more like, well, she had this accident, and so she was out of the picture for 30 years. Well, actually, no, I wasn't. I mean, I didn't. There was 30 years between my second and third books, but I wasn't out of the picture. I mean, I was working and raising a family and publishing lots of articles and book chapters. So I was professionally active, but I didn't write a general audience book. And so I think she took that to mean more than it did.
But is it true that you were scheduled to give a talk, you tripped, fell,
Broke my kneecap.
broke your kneecap, yeah. And then you got onto pain meds.
Well, no, what happened was the bone healed fine, but there was a lot of tissue damage, including nerve damage, a lot of hemorrhage and so on. And so I was left with chronic pain after that, the bone healed, but why was I still in pain? And it took a long time for them to come up with the right diagnosis, which was that I had grown these nerve tumors at the site of the knee where there'd been nerve damage. They're called neuromas. They're not malignant, but they're like having a raw nerve. So every time you take a step, it's sort of like having dental work without Novocaine, that sort of thing. So it was very painful. And I had the tumors removed several times, but the problem is they keep growing back. And eventually, the doc said, look, we can't there's so much scar tissue there, we can't keep doing surgery. So we're going to put you on crutches and a knee brace and a fentanyl patch. And so for 15 years or so, I was on a fentanyl patch that, demon drug saved my life. I mean, it enabled me to function. And it's a very powerful opioid. When it's
Did you get addicted? Did you get addicted to it?
Physiologically, sure.
Well, it's designed to addict you.
What?
It's designed to addict.
It enabled me to have a career and a family and that. And then in 2019, by pure luck, pure chance, I found out about a new kind of surgery that had been developed at Walter Reed for amputees, of which we had a great many, thanks to our forever wars. And amputees often had the same kind of nerve pain in their stumps as what I had. And so I said, sign me up. It was done in 2019 at Mass General. And after that, I was able to, I think whoever invented that surgery should get a free trip to Stockholm, in my view. I was able to give up the crutches and the brace and the fentanyl patch. And I now know why it's called cold turkey.
You went through all the symptoms?
Well, not for long. I mean, my pain management doc said, we can put you on a buprenorphine patch, which is tempered slowly. I was like, no, I was being pig-headed about it. I want to just get it over with. Well, that left.
How'd that go, Judy?
Well, you feel cold, really, really, really freezing cold, colder than you've ever felt. And the hair stands up on your arms. So you look like a plucked turkey. That's why it's called cold turkey.
I think we all just learned something. It's a phrase that's used so commonly, and yet I never thought, where does that come from?
Yeah. Well, anyway, after about 24 hours of that, I went crawling back to my pain management guy and said, about that buprenorphine.
So you were mentioning, you were talking about, amputees at Walter Reed and how, you decided that you would explore that surgery. And that leads me back to this comparison that you made professionally between soldiers who have experienced combat and a battered woman. The symptoms of PTSD are very similar. And I have read recently more about moral woundedness for soldiers. This is a spiritual wound because they are taken out of their value system and what they've been taught as right and wrong. And now they must behave in order to survive in a way that is morally corrupted to them. And it leads to an emotional scar. Is there an equation over on the domestic violence side?
Yes, very much so, because one of the most damaging methods of coercive control, which I didn't mention earlier, is forcing the victim to violate his or her own moral principles by harming others or failing to protect others. And so with battered women, a lot of times they'll bargain, just do anything you want to me, just don't hurt the kids. And then by the time he does hurt the kids, she's too terrified to intervene.
Mhm.
Or sometimes the oldest kid in an incest, who's on the incest usually starts with the oldest girl, and she'll bargain, just, just don't do it to my little sister. And then she runs away from home knowing perfectly well that he's going to do it to her little sister, and then of course with political prisoners, they are under torture. They're made to inform on their comrades. And it turned out there were about 10% of the Vietnam vets who had either harmed civilians or prisoners of war. And some had done it under orders, not all. They had the worst PTSD of all.
Meaning the combination of moral wounds.
Yeah.
And the other psychodynamic of PTSD. It was like a double down.
Right. It wasn't, they had not just the intrusive symptoms and the numbing symptoms and the hyperarousal, but they had that sense of I'm damned, I'm doomed, I'm an evil person. And so that is one of the most powerful techniques of coercive control, is forcing people to violate their own moral principles.
It's so interesting. It leads me to want to ask you about how you were able to blend in your books, Trauma and Recovery and Truth and Repair, these really hard topics. I mean, this is trauma at the level that you're describing. It's really difficult to read about.
Yeah.
Manage somehow to weave in stories, case studies, examples, information that inspire hope. And I just wondered if you did that consciously, or if when you're working with some of these victims of trauma with a capital T, do you see them move on with their lives eventually? Like, is it a hopeful story?
Yes. Yes. I mean, there are two things that keep me going. One is that, that many people make good recoveries, not everybody, but lots of people do, and that's inspiring. And then the other one, I always tell clinicians who are, doing this work, never do it alone. You've got to have your own posse. You've got to have your own buddies. I had my colleagues at the Victims of Violence program, and you think you've heard everything, and then somebody's gonna tell you a story that's just gonna totally blow your mind, that you couldn't even imagine in your wildest dreams that somebody would do such a thing to another person. And so you've got to have a shoulder to cry on. You've got to be able to come and talk to your colleagues and say, "You're not going to believe what I just heard." Have someone bearing witness for you.
Right. And this brings me to this idea of, as we encounter these things in our lives, hopefully a lot of our listeners don't have a lot of trauma with a capital T, but certainly when we have, serious setbacks, serious situations that do leave us with some trauma, talk about the importance of being able to describe that, to create a narrative about it. And I wonder if the reasoning you give is that it helps the victim to integrate that story into the larger story of their lives, so that then they can write a story of the future for themselves.
Right.
Carl Jung, the concept of integration was big for him. It's a tent pole of his theories. But, when we talk about being able to integrate something into the psyche, it's a big idea. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Like when you encounter somebody who has done the work toward recovery and they have begun to integrate their story into the larger picture of their lives, how does that show up? Are you able to observe it?
Yeah, because basically, who observed this quite beautifully over a century ago was Pierre Janet. And he said, normal memory is the action of telling the story, not only to other people, but also to ourselves. And he said, trauma memories, and now, of course, we have neuroscience that shows us pictures of this. It's not a verbal narrative. It's images, it's smells, it's, sounds, it's bodily sensations. It's often frozen in time, that sort of impact moment. And so it's like an eternal present.
An eternal present.
And what you want is a story that has past, present, and future, a verbal narrative. And when you could actually look at fMRI studies of people when they've done the integrative work, and the type of memory storage is different.
Really? It has direct impact on the brain.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Judith Herman, MD, internationally renowned scholar on trauma and practicing psychiatrist. What an honor to talk to you today. Is there anything you wished I would have asked you, or is there anything you'd like to say as we wrap up?
Just say thank you for having me and for this very interesting conversation. Maybe I'll leave you with a bit of wisdom from my mama, who, my mama was always right. And one of the things she said that I think is relevant to our discussion is that activism is the antidote to despair. And so, when you're dealing with injustices on the scale that we encounter them, being part of a social movement for social justice is what engenders hope.
It's a perfect place to end, Judy. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2025 donors who gave at the sporting level and above. Arlo Kompang, Usha and Ashok Baby, David Dalrymple in honor of Tom Kapasinskas, Peter Demuth, Mary Doherty, Carl Greer, Ken James, David Johnson, Marianne Johnson, John Manning in honor of Janine Mellinger, Mona Manning, Boris Matthews, Kenan McKee, Karen Newland, Murray Stein in honor of Lee Roloff, Mary Tice, Lawrence Tingley, Alexander Wayne, Ellen Young, and the Kapagangula Ramji Charitable Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.